All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second class of our 5-session online seminar, Getting Started in Family History Research. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating tonight's class. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. Our instructor for this second class is Chief Genealogist David Allen Lambert. David has been on the staff of American Ancestors since 1993, and he is an internationally recognized speaker on the topics of genealogy and history. He has published many articles in the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the New Hampshire Genealogical Record, Rhode Island Roots, the Mayflower Descendant, and American Ancestors magazine. He has also published a guide to Massachusetts cemeteries. David is an elected fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, and he is also a life member of the New Hampshire Society of the Cincinnati. He is also the tribal genealogist for the Massachusetts Punkapog Indians of Massachusetts. His genealogical expertise includes New England and Atlantic Canadian records of the 17th through 21st century, military records, DNA research, and Native American and African American genealogical research in New England. So last week, Melanie talked about identifying what you know, and now David will talk about how to determine what you want to know. So in this class, he'll walk you through the process of formulating questions and goals and provide an overview of key records that family historians turn to answer their research questions. He'll also offer helpful tips to keep you on task and not overwhelmed. As we did last week, we will have 3 breaks for questions during tonight's session. So at any time while David is talking, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you will be able to go back and watch a recording of tonight's presentation on that course page. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm delighted to join you for the second part of Getting Started in Family History Research, and I will also be giving your class next week as well. But tonight we're going to talk about the part where you're going to want to learn more, that curiosity in family history. So, what do you want to learn? Now, although the word research has the word search embedded in it, research is far more than just searching. And this module is going to cover the what and the where of researching, the planning and the strategy. We'll talk about a research plan that you can develop and actually download from American Ancestors. We'll discuss the what and make that plan to begin answering your questions. We'll do the where, and that's online and other repositories where you might be able to find some things, and talk about the how, the general principles. We'll consult multiple sources, and we'll gather as many records as possible about a family or individual that you can find and track your research. And we'll do more on the research logs next week, but just want to introduce the idea that when you're doing your research, it's always good to have a plan and then how to facilitate it, what resources are best that exist, and how to find what does exist. Because you might have expectations on, well, there must always be records in the 1600s for all of the 13 colonies. Well, you might be surprised there may not be for all of them. Or you might be looking for immigration records for your ancestor and find out, well, that those records may have burned. So let's talk about now the next step, which is, of course, what? Research planning itself. Okay, we're going to start by creating your research question. And a typical question might be, I want to know. And that really comes down to clarifying the time, the place, and the name. So for an example, when we are starting in family history, we begin by having questions about the missing details in our family tree. Maybe someone had done a chart long ago and you've looked at it, or you've started one yourself. And well, like every tree, there were bare branches. And these gaps will give you that need to want to do more research. But how about if you're new to with the research? Or you may just not know the specific steps involved to locate that detail. This idea of creating a research plan and next week with a research log will help you kind of identifying the next step. And then, of course, Melanie will continue on class after mine next week on class 4. We're actually undertaking some research and then Rhonda at the last class will talk about analyzing it all. So first stage of clarifying your questions, you might want to ask yourself, approximately when was he born? Do you know where he was born? And what was his name? Now, remember last week when Melanie talked about interviewing? These may be some of the things that you were engaged in thinking about. If you have older family members or older siblings or aunts or uncles or cousins that you can reach out to that might help you glean some of that detail before you have to research it yourself. It's always good. My grandmother used to say, charity starts at home. And interview yourself. What do you remember about relatives or what you may have heard? That can be your starting point. Creating good research questions. First, you're going to want to create one or more research questions, and creating a good research question helps ensure a solid foundation for your research. You want to identify what makes that person unique, the spouse, the family, the occupation, and make the question specific. Make them answerable and realistic and timely as well. I mean, the idea that you're researching your Smith family and you want to identify every Smith in your family tree back 800 years, well, is it realistic? How much time do you have anyways? And is it answerable based on records? So this is the type of thing. So maybe you might formulate a question that's a specific goal that answers something on your family tree that you haven't found yet. You want to include the name, the place, and the date in question regarding the subject. You want to focus on genealogical questions, identity, kinship, and events, and don't overwhelm yourself. Focus on one person at a time. It really is good to put on blinders because you can get a little overloaded when you open up a source of records and you've fallen down that rabbit hole and you found other ancestors to research and you kind of gotten off the path of where you originally were. And that's where the research plan will come in handy. Sample research questions. So let's start with one hypothetically. Who are the parents of Elizabeth Harris, who married Martin Powell in Vermont in 1778? Now, first off, what do you specifically hope to learn about the parents? So we don't know their names yet, but so what do you specifically need to know? Well, first off, you need to know their names because that's going to be the identifying factor for the rest of it, such as their vital records and place of residence. So again, knowing where they live might be a clue based on where Elizabeth and Martin were married in Vermont. So there's kind of a start of your questions and maybe put part of your research planning into finding that record first. And ultimately, you'd like to find for the parents their birth, their marriage, and their death, dates and places for all of those events. And guess what? Now you have the parents. You're going to obviously want Elizabeth's grandparents. But again, don't get off track. Stick with the first question here and hope to find the parents. Now, one of the things about genealogy that can be very tough, and we have this happen with patrons that will come into the library and they'll say, I'm researching the Cabot family, and my ancestors, so and so married thus and such. And before you know, the individual, with no harm to us, have rattled off a lot of detail in an entire lineage, but they haven't focused in on their initial question. And I hate to say it, contrary to somewhat some patrons might think, not all genealogists have thousands of lineages memorized. Even myself, who's worked with NEHDS American Ancestors since 1993, I've got a good amount upstairs in my brain, but I don't know everybody's ancestors, or at least not yet. So it is important to go beyond a name and also anchor the name to a time and place. Even unique sounding names tend not to be something that you're going to find. So we'll take a look at the next slide. You have Eliphalet Follett. Sounds pretty unique, but do you realize in 1850, there in Monroe, Ohio, there's 2 in Lyme, Ohio, 1 in Winchester, New Hampshire, and 1 in Fayette, Ohio. Well, the New Hampshire one you might be able to rule out, but those ones in Ohio, well, maybe those are possible candidates. Well, which one is he? So you need to understand that even uncommon names back in the 19th century may not be so unique. Now you want to ask yourself these questions. What are you hoping to accomplish? Example, looking for an event such as a birth, a marriage, a death, or even immigration. Are you looking for a name? Again, like with Elizabeth, are we looking for their as a parent, a child, or maybe the person's maiden name if it's a female? Is the reason that you're hoping to accomplish this because you need to fill out the paperwork to join a lineage society like the Mayflower descendants or the Daughters of the American Revolution or Sons of the American Revolution? What records do I already have? Again, charity starts at home. Have you inherited your family's papers from your parents, grandparents, or even earlier generations? Do you have old family Bibles, personal family papers, naturalization certificates for citizenship? You might have the key documents that are going to be right there in a strong box or in the old family Bible that you can use. So one of the things that you may want to also do is maybe you've dabbled in genealogy for a long time and you've already got these resources that you used. Knowing a research plan and then ultimately next week doing a research log will allow you to not recreate the wheel. There's no point of going and looking for something and only find out, oh, yeah, I tried that 3 years ago. You can refer back to a research plan and then ultimately a research log to know what you want. It rules it out. And then perhaps when you come to a place like American Ancestors, we can sit down and go over at the reference desk what you've looked at gives us a clearer picture than hearing the whole story, even though I love a good genealogy story. Focusing the genealogical question itself. So again, so much you can research, but focus, focus, focus. Genealogical data, the identity of the person, the events surrounding their life, and their relationships. Now, obviously, there are a lot of key documents here that you could use to establish a lot of these. The census record is one thing that comes to mind, puts together households. The various documents may show relationships like a marriage record or a birth record, etc. For example, who are the parents? What is the date or place of birth? What is the date or place of marriage? What is the date or place of death? What is the spouse's name or maiden name? And who are the siblings? That's for each one of your ancestors if you don't know it. And think about it, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, that number doubles every generation. So you get a lot of questions per each person to fill in. Now, again, that is limited in a lot of cases to what records survive. So don't get too hung up on that. Start to look for the questions you want to have answered, and then we'll talk about the resources that you can use to find those. Now, do not get overwhelmed. The last thing I want to see anybody in genealogy is get so frustrated that you put it in a box and you don't look at it again, and it's your great great grandchildren are going to find your uncompleted family tree. Try to focus on a single person it's to start off with and a few events for that person. Really take the baby steps in this because it will save your sanity and also will focus your time. As you probably know, American Ancestors is opening up later this month, and we are going to be welcoming genealogists who really have not been in the building since 2023 when we closed for our renovations. I'm sure there's a lot of them with backed up shopping lists, but as I will advise every single one that comes in the door, from the new genealogist to the one that's been doing it for years, limit your shopping list and go at them one at a time. And you also want to set a time limit for your help itself, because you're going to want to not overwhelm yourself and you don't want to go in and do research and find out I've just spent 6 hours of my entire day on one question. Maybe you want to break it down, set a little alarm on your phone that will beep. All right, now I've been doing this ancestor for an hour, let's go to the next one. And again, try not to fall down rabbit holes with multiple ancestors. This happens a lot in the library, especially up on the 7th floor, where people will walk in where all our published genealogies are, and they'll go looking for the Robinson genealogy, but they happen to walk by the Richardson Memorial genealogy, and oh, I need that too. Pull the book, start looking at that. They bring it back to their table. An hour later, they realize, what did I go into stacks to begin with, anyways? Make that research plan. It will save you. It's kind of like a shopping list that you bring to the grocery store. Tip, work from the known to the unknown. This is true with the beginning genealogist all the way with a new ancestor that a genealogist that may have been doing it for decades. You have some facts about that person. Now, what we're going to do is going to work back to try to solve that missing gap, that birth, that marriage, that death. Maybe did they have a probate? Where are they buried? What do you know about their children? What happened to their children? Did they die early? Did they get married? Did they have descendants? So you can see that the ripple of throwing that one pebble into the pond can cause a lot of other questions that come from it. I like to call this rinse and repeat. Step one, write down the known facts. Step two, identify what is missing. Step three, locate and identify the sources. Step four, research. And step five, analyze. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm just talking about all the 5 classes that you're going to be attending. We're right now at step two. But this idea of going back over things, and this will also be on your syllabus to remind you, is a great way of getting all of your facts straight. And at the end, you're going to have some solid evidence to pass on to the next generation. Let's talk about creating a research plan. Well, first off, I might want to start with, well, what is a research plan? A research plan provides a roadmap for your genealogical research. It can be a plan as a formal statement or document, but really doesn't have to be. It includes a statement or questions that defines your research goals, outlines a step to achieve your research goal, and will obviously list some certain things, the identity of the person you want, the events that you may already know, and relationships. All of these are starting points for developing a great research plan. Now, I'm going to go over some, and this is also in your syllabus for you, steps for researching research planning. Determine your goal. What do you want to know? Again, going back to that great grandmother or great 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 grandfather that you always wanted to research, document the known facts. What do you already know about the subject of your research and the specific research question itself that you're hoping to solve? Educate yourself about the records. What records are available for your time and place that your ancestor lived in? And that's going to vary on country, it's going to vary on century, and what records are most likely to answer your question. Now, I want to tell you that American Ancestors offers a great service Monday through Saturday, 9 to 5 Eastern, called Ask a Genealogist. Are you not sure about the resources? Of course, I'd love to say that I can answer all of your resource questions tonight between the three chances we're going to have question and answer, but we have that available for you free of charge. You just can go into the Ask a Genealogist portal on American Ancestors, and you can actually chat with a genealogist on our staff here in Boston. And you might say, I don't know where I can find deeds for. Well, hopefully after the next couple of classes, we're going to give you the clues of some of those places to find, but you might find some unique thing that you want to learn about. Don't be afraid. Why suffer? Ask us. That's what we're here for. And we're approaching 180 years of doing such things. We were founded back in 1845. Again, now the other part of the step is create the plan. Use a template guide for your thinking. Well, I'm going to give you one of the probably the best tips of the whole night. This tip is download a free research plan from American Ancestors. Yes, and the keyword here is free. And it's one of those type of forms that you can type over. So you don't have to print it off and handwrite it. You can actually actively use it. So let me show you how to find that. If you go simply to americanancestors.org, the next step I'm going to show you is I'm going to hover over this part of the screen and where I can pull down under Tools, Research Templates. When I click on that, it will bring me to the research templates page where we can get a research plan template, the research log, which we're going to talk about next week. And there are other options that you can have here, including interview questions, family questionnaires. So we want to have you get that download. And again, you'll find the link on your syllabus as well. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. So don't have to go download it right now in the middle of our class. Instructions for research plan template. The research subject. Write down what you know about the subject Information in this section helps establish the identity of the research subject, and that is what makes him or her unique. What's your research question? The research question should include a name, place, and time period to help anchor your research. Now, what is known about the question? You want to fill out what you know about the specific question being researched. Identifying the source of your knowledge helps sift the facts from your family lore. So here is what that research plan template looks like, obviously a little further blown up, that you can download right from American Ancestors. And right off the top, you can see the research subject: name, birthplace, marriage, death place, names and birth dates of children, and additional information might be family lore. Well, guess what, folks? There's no right or wrong answer here. Even at the base minimum, if you have a name, you have an approximate time when you know they were living, because maybe you know that they had a child born in 1910. So obviously they're probably born 18 years or so before. You can put in an approximate date. You know where your grandmother was born, but you're not sure her father's born? Well, maybe that place might be the same state or same country. Marriage information. Maybe you know your great grandmother's first name, but not her maiden name. And death place. Well, you may have remembered your grandmother saying that both of her parents had died by the time she was 20 years old. You know how old your grandmother is, so now you can approximate when the death is. See, you're just already putting down facts just from your own knowledge or from some of the research you may have done. Birth dates of children. Well, say in case it's your grandmother. Remember your grandaunts and granduncles' names, great aunt, great uncles? Well, you might remember their first names, may not know all of what the maiden names were of every person or their dates, but if you put a few down, that might help you identify the family when you're researching, say, the census. The next thing is, of course, your research question. Well, there's a lot of fill in the blanks here. What is your specific question? Is it overall on the person? Is it maybe you're trying to find their marriage, their parents, like we were talking about earlier for Elizabeth for up in Vermont? And what is known about the question itself? So you can put down some of the facts that you may know, and even oral history is a useful clue. So what we look at next in the plan template is what is known about the question and how is it known? Was it something that you had as an oral story that had been passed down? So this is where you want to put into the facts and have this available about your particular question, because it's going to spark your own knowledge and will help you identify if you find a reference or resource that it's going to fit in. So it matches. My earliest genealogy question was about my own great grandfather. My grandmother had told me her father was on a whaling ship. Early on, I guess on my research plan template, if I had filled one out at that point in time years ago, I would have put down my research question is confirm that he was on a whaling ship. So when in the case of my ancestor, I went in and I found where the whaling ship logs were, and somebody had indexed all of them. I found out exactly the vessel he was on, and later even found the logbook of the ship. All right. Now let's talk about the instructions for the research plan template. Record dates. Now for each principal location of the research, you can use familysearch.org, their research wiki. So if you're trying to find a location and you want to find out if there's records, the Family Search Wiki is free, and you can find an article on a county, a town, a state, or a province, or even a different country. And you can use the table in the wiki article to populate this section on the form. The name of the place, when it was formed, the earliest record dates, and you can conclude with a note about any known record loss. Yeah, unfortunately, fires, floods, and things do occasionally happen, and even wars. What is the working hypothesis? Record your best guess about what is happening, what the answer might be, or where you might find the answer to your question. What records will I need? Well, you want to identify the principal records you will need to help answer your question. And that's where American Ancestors can come into handy by through Ask a Genealogist, pose a question, or You may have a resource guide that you turn to that talks about researching in New Hampshire or Massachusetts that you have, maybe a book. So look at some of those helpful guides. One of the ones I recommend is, of course, the New England Handbook that my colleague Rhonda McClure wrote, and that is great for the who, what, and the where for Massachusetts. And I'm sure she'll be including that in her syllabus for her details. So let's move on. What do you already know? Well, about the subject, it's known about the subject of your research, but also the question of interest itself. So where and when for your subject. It's helpful to list the vital events with a place if you know any of that. So again, taking your own information that you have or maybe research and put it down so you're not reinventing the wheel. The name of the spouse or spouses, the names and dates of birth of all the children. All of this is useful. So when you're maybe sitting down, even if you're having a consultation with a member of American Ancestors or talking at one of the reference genealogists on the desk, you're not having them track down something with you that, well, oh, you already have that. It's not bad to reconfirm something, but if you have a specific goal in mind, may it be something unique that you really don't have a lot of detail to about the question, not just what you know, but how you know it. Again, how did you find it? Is it a reliable source? Not saying your grandfather telling you a story on the back porch back when you were a kid isn't reliable, but the telephone game of genealogy is a little tricky. If you knew a story when you were a kid and you told it to the classmate next to you in the row in your class, by the time it got to the end of the other part of the classroom, that story might be changed a little bit. Somebody embellished it or forgot what you said. How about if you span something from long ago? So let's say it was the 1960s and one of your grandparents told you a story. Well, that's great. And that story is from the Civil War. It's 100 years ago. Well, where did they hear it from? Well, maybe they told you. Maybe it was from their grandparent that was a child at the time of the Civil War. Or maybe they even knew their great grandfather who was in the Civil War. So the closer you can get to when the record was kept about that person, the more reliable it is, you might think. The other caveat to that is the fact that somebody's story may have changed. I have heard stories that were passed down by countless genealogists who turn out, well, they weren't the hero at the Battle of Gettysburg. They were actually in a hospital 100 miles away and never made it to Gettysburg. Or they were the hero at the day at a particular battle in the Revolution. Well, turns out they hadn't even enlisted yet. Sometimes inflating the story of our ancestors happens just because it's over the amount of time. Focus on what is relevant to the research question itself, and that will cause you not to go off the path. Again, what we want to focus on is your research subject and what is known about the question and how it is known. Again, the solid way of getting the best part of your research plan done. So the next slide I'm going to talk to you about is what is known about the subject, how to fill it out. So remember Elizabeth Harris we spoke about earlier? Her name, Elizabeth Harris, born circa 1738, place unknown. Well, we know approximately how old she was, and that her marriage date was 1778 in Manchester, Vermont. And we now know she's married to Martin Powell. And death place, well, we don't know what happened to her. Names and birth dates of her children, all in Manchester between 1779 and 1782. Now, an example of this piece of research plan for the question is about who are the parents of Elizabeth Harris. The purpose of writing this down is to have it as a handy reference when you actually begin your research. It also consolidates it. A lot of people will bring large binders in or computers, and how about if they forgot to update their file or they can't log on? Having some of these research plans set up in a small binder might be the answer for you to start collecting your information. So here we get into the research question itself. So who are the parents of Elizabeth Harris? What is known about the question? Well, her husband, Martin Powell, was born in Armenia, New York. And we know that the source of fact from something we found on Find a Grave. found his gravestone. We know that Martin's first wife was Rhoda Thompson, who died in 1777, the year before Elizabeth and Martin got married. And they also were from Manchester, Vermont. We found that in the Vermont vital records. Now, the next part, Rhoda may have been married to Martin in Armenia, New York. We know that from somebody's tree on Ancestry. But as we know with some time of those shaky leaves, give you a clue, but they may not be from a solid primary source or fact. Anybody can fill in a place and a date on a tree, but unless they anchor it with the source of the document, it's really a hypothesis. Now, in the research plan template from there, we have those records, dates for reference, and we now have a working hypothesis. So on a working hypothesis, we might have thought the following. What is this that we know about Elizabeth? Well, we know for a fact that Elizabeth Harris was a widow in Manchester, Vermont when she married Martin Powell. We found that when we got a marriage record. So what do we know here? That was she a spinster when she married Martin Powell? So we have confirmed from the vital record that she was a widow. So first off, we know her maiden name isn't Harris. So one of the things you might start looking for are deaths of a person with the last name of Harris in Manchester, Vermont, that might have a widow mentioned in their probate or in a deed. And then you might start looking at Harrises that are getting married to Elizabeths. Because remember, when she got married, she was born about 39 years old, 40 years old. She had kids for a couple more years into her early 40s, but she obviously has room to have children earlier and been married for maybe over 20 years before. Now, the research plan template at the end, which records will I need and what is my search strategy? Now, in the research plan template, what records I would need in a basic approach are marriage records for Manchester, Vermont. And purpose, well, I want to find the first marriage of Elizabeth Harris. Now, what are the source or repositories that I have discovered as a genealogist, or I talked to our Ask a Genealogist service, and they suggested the following sources or repositories. FamilySearch.org has millions of images of different records around the world, and you may find it there. Perhaps you might look at the vital records for Vermont, which are on American Ancestors, or even on Ancestry.com. Now, the vital records for Armenia, New York. Purpose of looking at those, the first marriage or any mention of a Harris family. Maybe that's where they came from. Maybe she followed the same path that her husband, second husband, did. Where are you going to find those records? Well, Family Search, American Ancestors, or Ancestry.com are all plausible places to try. Town history of Manchester, Vermont. Any mention of the Harris family. Obviously, a lot of vital records going on there. Children are being born there. Multiple marriages are going on. Did somebody write a town history that gives the information about this family? Well, sometimes town histories are great for having a chapter on genealogy, and that will give you a great clue. Now, using the Family Search Wiki, what did I find out about Manchester, Vermont? Well, I found out it was formed in 1761. And I need to know this because Vermont Vital Records started when the town was created. Now, Elizabeth was born about 1738, so probably not Manchester. But if she was an early settler, her first marriage might indicate if her marriage was to Martin Powell, or in fact, it was a second. Now, we know from the record that we found on her marriage in 1778 that she was a widow. That is our big clue there. So we know that Harris is not the name we're going to look for, but for that to be the clue for finding her first husband. In Armenia, New York, vital records don't begin until 1749, which are clearly after Elizabeth's birth. Now, on a more advanced sense of this version of the chart gives the names of specific databases to be searched and their URLs. So you can do this kind of scouring the sources you want to do. So this is right in my research plan. Record, card index and vital records in the early land and town records of Manchester, Vermont. Why am I looking at it? The purpose is to find the first marriage of Elizabeth Harris. Source or repository, I have the link right there to search family search because I found where those Manchester, Vermont town record and land records are, and I'll begin my search there. Hopefully they're indexed, or if not, the images are viewable, then I can search through them online. Next set of records, vital records 1749 to 1786 for Armenia, New York. Again, I'm looking for the first marriage or any mention of the Harris family. I've got my family search link right there. John Pettlemone's Early History of Manchester, Proceedings of the Vermont Historical Society, 1930. Again, looking for clues to this Harris family. This sounds like a great local history to look for. So again, these are the same questions we had in the basic form, but this is more advanced. And the nice thing about your research plan, you can always amend it, part one, part two, because you might have a new amended look at resources you want to get with your research log. And as you progress in your research, might find a new source. And then, of course, what we're looking for in the history is on a book that's actually right online on the vermonthistory.org that has that PDF of that history that we can look at. Of course, we have the research plan. We've gone over the research subject, the research question, what is known about the question and how it is known, record dates for reference, working hypotheses, which records I will need, and a search strategy. As a rule, I take about an hour to get a good research plan underway before I go to a repository. And I do research at other places other than American Ancestors. I've been up to Canada, over to Europe, and I put together plans like this because it really focuses in on I only have a certain amount of limited hours or days, or maybe even the whole week, and I know what I want to accomplish. Having this is going to be a great way of attacking each research project. And again, the research log we'll talk about next week. We'll talk about what you are doing and how to rule out what you find. All right, at this point, I think we're going to turn to questions. And thank you very much for your attention during this first part.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for that start to tonight's class. A lot of great information there. If any of you do have any questions, go ahead and pop them into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. So David, first up, we did have a question here asking about kind of as you're making a research plan as a beginner, is it best to focus on one line or kind of one generation first? So for example, looking at all four of my grandparents and kind of going with what I know about all four grandparents, or should a beginner just kind of pick one and then try to get back as far as they can with that one person?
Sure.
Any recommendations for that?
Yeah, of course. I think the way you have to look at it is obviously with Elizabeth, we're dealing with two people partly because we have Elizabeth Harris, we have Martin Powell. So that's somebody's great, 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 great grandparents. So you're dealing with two people. But the reason we're looking for two people here is because the clue is going to be in the marriage record. Ultimately, though, our research question is to find Elizabeth's parents. So each of your questions that you have when you're looking at your notes might be a specific question per each grandparent. So again, you can download that research plan template, save it as a template on your computer, create one, save it, move on and do the next grandparent. I find that it's easier to concentrate on individuals. Now, maybe those are the individuals on your maternal side of the family, and then maybe you'll concentrate the next trip or your next plan on your paternal side. But again, creating a checklist and prioritize your research. There's no reason to say, these are my top 10 genealogical questions I hope to find this year. Sort of like your genealogical New Year's Eve resolution. That's what I'm going to find this year. May that plan template be the guide to allowing you to complete that task.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. And then another question here. Someone asks, what if in the process of answering a question, it leads to more questions that you want to remember and pursue later? Do you take the time to start additional research plans at that time?
I make enough notes that I can go back. I mean, if I'm in the course of researching at, say, even American Ancestors, I'm going to make notes. I'm going to make copies, scans, whatever the case might be. In every question that you solve, adds more questions to the whole bulk of your research. I would sit down and carefully, like I say, I take a good hour to put together a research plan because it's not just filling in the blanks of the names, what you know, and the questions. It's looking up what the record limits are, finding those dates on Family Search to know what records from Manchester, Vermont existed, what fire may have occurred that I'm not going to find any records, um, and what have I already searched. So that way I'm not reinventing the wheel. So again, each one of your questions that you're going to do, don't create another research plan at the facility. If you have to quickly on the fly, that's fine. But I would save it for your next trip because the chances are when you solve a few problems, you're going to come back with a few more questions that you want to solve.
All right. Thank you so much, David. So it's looking like that wraps up our questions for now. So as always, if you do have any questions that arise during the presentation, you can pop them into the Q&A panel. We have two more Q&A sessions, so we'll get to them then. But for now, I think we'll just keep things moving along, and I will turn things back over to you, David.
Thank you, Kathleen. All right, now we're going to talk about learning standard sources and records. Again, it's not applicable to everything, but will probably fall into the case for a lot of the things that you're looking for. Now, first off, definitions and sources of records themselves. Now, a source is a coherent collection of records created by a single jurisdiction, obviously a place like a town that your ancestors from, or a single author for a defined purpose. Now, a record is that portion of a source which pertains to a single event. So obviously, birth records are going to be in the same jurisdiction of the same town that maybe the tax records are, but tax records are different. So going back to Manchester, Vermont, as I kind of break this in, the jurisdiction is Manchester, Vermont. The first record I want to find is that marriage record. Well, those are going to be in the town clerk's records, birth, marriages, and deaths. But I want to know more. Is there land records? Well, that's the same jurisdiction, but it's a different record. And as you look at the breakdown of records that exist for a community, or even discussing with the town historian of that community, or even again talking with our Ask a Genealogist help, you can identify that there's not just one record that's going to solve all things. Now, that being said, maybe that source is that town history that was done in the 1890s. It answers all things. But I hate to tell you, most of them aren't cited. The sources aren't there. So you want to determine where the author got his or her sources from years ago. So as you can see, you have some more records to find. Now, this is kind of a fun little bubble cloud sort of way of looking at it. So we're going to begin off with the first one in the upper left-hand corner, source, U.S. Federal Census. Well, what's the record we're hoping to find? The next slide is going to show us, reveal, the reason we're looking at the census is going to talk to us about the household. How about the next? And the next one is going to be church registers. So if we hover over to the next slide, what is the record we're looking for? A baptism, marriage, or burial. Now, this may seem very simplistic, but a source and a record, I'm just using this as an example. How about cemetery? What is the record source that we're looking for there? Well, in that case, we're looking for gravestones, or even maybe the cemetery records or transcriptions. And lastly, county courthouse. What can I find at that source? Well, I can find a variety of records, and that includes probate packets, probate record books, deeds, maybe a variety of different things. Every county courthouse might be a little bit different. Now, the summary of standard sources that genealogists use are sort of like our wish list that we hope all of these survive are vital records. And that could be the birth, marriages, and deaths recorded on the town, the county, or the state level, or if you're in Canada, county or province, or places overseas. Using England, for instance, civil registration of vital records didn't occur until 1837. Before that, you had church records. So, next step, census. In the United States, we've had a census every 10 years since 1790. Now, the only exception is we lost the 1890 census for the most part in a fire in the early part of the 20th century. So there are limits, even though you can find something that is countrywide. But there are also other censuses. Within a census itself, you can have state censuses, church censuses, even town censuses. You might think of those like poll tax books, listing of the taxpayers. Now, passenger list and immigration and naturalization records, these are great, but they're not always a passenger list. And of course, naturalization records in the United States only start in 1791. Before that, we're a British colony. There's no need of being naturalized in the British colonies if you're a British subject to begin with. Passenger lists have its limits too. I'd like to say there is a passenger list from the first vessel that arrived on these shores from Europe and all the way through, but there are limits. In some cases in colonial New England, we don't have a passenger list. We have what are called embarkation records, and those are the records of individuals asking for permission to come across and settle in New England or elsewhere. Military records are great. Now, the modern ones are wonderful. You sometimes can find every bit of detail, blood type, hair color, eye color. You can find out when they were discharged, when they were hospitalized, but there are limits. Some of the United States military records in a fire in 1973 in St. Louis, Missouri, destroyed a lot of the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Air Corps and Air Force records starting from 1912 on. So a lot of those records are gone, but there are other places you can find them. So don't let one spill off of the sidewalk cause you to think that you can't get back on the path. Try local, your local adjutant general's office, your town veterans agent. And again, records are going to vary. The military records for muster rolls of 17th century colonial militia are going to be very limited. And is that Thomas Smith really yours? Or is that possibly another Thomas Smith? The records by the time you get into the end of the Revolutionary War include things called descriptive rolls. And descriptive rolls give identifying factors like age, location where somebody's from, and they're not just lists of veterans, soldiers. Newspapers. There have been newspapers published in the United States since 1704. The first one was the Boston Newsletter. We do have one other paper that was published back in 1690, but only for one issue. It was forbidden to publish a newspaper. The British Crown thought that we would have more freedom of speech. Little did they know a little thing would occur less than 100 years later that would give us as much freedom as we wished. Church records and cemeteries are another great source. Church records are going to vary. You need to know the denomination. And sometimes you can determine that by finding out who married your ancestor. Is the name of the clergyman, whatever faith, listed? Is it her church or his church? Typically, it was the bride's, but not always. Cemeteries are great resources. Not all cemeteries have offices, though. Sometimes they're gravestones. But living in the 21st century, we can be grateful for other genealogists that have gone out on websites such as Find a Grave and Billion Graves around the world and photographing gravestones and put the information out there. So maybe you're not close to that cemetery, but it's as close as your keyboard if you look for it. Published genealogies are also wonderful. At American Ancestors, we have over 200,000 such books, but we also have access to many books that are currently online. You can search for many genealogy books out of copyright on places like archive.org or HathiTrust. Census substitute, one of the things that you might look for your ancestors starting in 1789 for most of the East Coast cities, you will find the starting point of a city directory. Boston had its first one, New York and Philadelphia soon after. So it's not going to be standard every place in 1789. Boston actually was the first, but you will find that city directories exist and give you the name, the address, and often the occupation of your ancestor. Let's talk specifically more about vital records. So with vital records, the one thing I want to bring up is a tip. Use vital records to answer the date and kinship questions that you have on your research plan. Here's an example of a death record post 1906. Well, what am I trying to find out here about Maud Bell Plowman? Well, I can tell you right on her death record from this one in 1947, I can get her husband's name is George Taylor Plowman. I get her birth date recorded, or I may find out that it's 72 years, 8 months, 5 days, and I can calculate it back. I can find out that her father's name is Reverend Newton Hervey Bell. So now I have her maiden name. So I'm not just stuck with Plowman in my family tree anymore. And I can also get another maiden name, that of her mother, Emma Hall Curtis. Tells me that her father is born in Iowa, her mother's born in New York. So this vital record gives a lot of great clues. It's also other things on there where in this case, she was cremated, and it gives me her cause of death, which will help with my family health history. Now, not all vital records are the same. These are vital records pre-1906 for Vermont, and this is filled out by town clerks based on their own records, and they really vary on the level of completeness because there may not have been a lot of detail there. So Mary Batchelor's birth on the 22nd of June, 1743. Her father is Nathan Batchelor. Her mother's name is Anna. Well, in a 1947 death record, we would probably find out what Anna's maiden name is. It wasn't something recorded 200 years before. Now, on the right-hand side, we have a little bit different. We have that Callista M. Chamberlain was born November 6, 1859. We now have her mother's maiden name. It's simply Helen. Mother's birthplace, however, is in Nelson, New Hampshire. Mother's residence is in District 2 in Brattleboro, Vermont. And the husband's name is Dana Chamberlain, her father, and he was born in Guilford. So now, if I was trying to figure out what Helen's maiden name is, this clue might tell me to look at Guilford or maybe Nelson, New Hampshire, to see if, in fact, that's where she was married. Vital records can often give you a lot of information in some cases, and this is from a birth record in Brookline, Massachusetts, recorded in 1899. We have Edward Grossman Plowman. He was born at 673 Washington Street to George T. and Maud Bell. Remember, we got Maud's death record before. If we had looked at her son's birth record in 1896, recorded 51 years before, we would have had a clue right there to her maiden name. It also gives me the information regarding that her father was a superintendent. He was born in Maine, and she was born in Turkey, Asia Minor. Vital records, published town records. Now, in this case, we have a published vital record. And in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, starting in the early 20th century, a systematic record keeping, money was available for places such as NEHCS, American Ancestors, the Worcester Antiquarian Society, the Essex Institute, and others to go out, find original vital records in town clerks, churches, cemeteries, and transcribe them, put them in alphabetical order, which is very convenient. Many of these books are already transcribed and available on American Ancestors, such as this entry for Sutton, Massachusetts, where Asa Grosvenor of Pomfret and Hannah Hall were married April 24th, 1766. And there's a little asterisk after that date. And if you look at the bottom of the page, it's a little hard to read. And if you've got a really blown up screen, it says intention not recorded. Sometimes the intention is a place and where the marriage is recorded and not necessarily where the marriage happened. So maybe that this marriage is Asa's hometown where he filed his intention of marriage to Hannah, and you can find it occurred weeks or months before. Some vital record caveats. Birth, marriage, and death records are going to exist, but not for all places and not for every year. Often provide the names of individuals, parents, and or spouse. Depending on the state records, it may be held on the state level, the county level, and or the town or city level. And that's going to vary from every part of the country. Privacy restrictions are also going to limit your access because they may not have access wholeheartedly for all vital records. The state of Vermont clearly open into the late 20th century in some cases and even beyond. However, other states have limits such as what you'll find online on Ancestry.com or Family Search or American Ancestors, may because the vital record office of that county, state, or that town clerk has limits of what they're going to release. Sometimes it's 50 years, sometimes it's 100 years. And remember, certified versus genealogical or information copies are available for vital records. The certified copy will usually be everything, and it's a certified copy and will cost you the most. Genealogical or informational copies will not be certified, therefore, you can't use them on a legal basis, but they may have the details that you want. But if you do get a genealogical or informational copy, let me stress, ask the place you're getting it from if it contains all the detail. If it's only a few dollars more or a couple of dollars more, I would opt to get the certified copy. That way you get all of the facts.
All right. Thanks so much, David. So we will now turn to questions. We actually don't have any questions in at the moment, but I always like to kind of give everyone a few seconds here in case anyone's frantically typing away. So I'll just pause for a moment and see if anyone would like to submit a question. Otherwise, we'll kind of keep things moving along and we'll always have that final question session at the end. So I'll just give you all one more moment here.
I can actually toss out a verbal tip that you with
Yeah.
vital records. I can since we got to fill a little bit of time. Um, you may find that a person's marriage is recorded in three places. They could record a marriage intention in one town and be married in another, but the marriage also might be recorded in the bride or groom's town because they happen to do so. So I've seen marriages recorded in up to three different places. The important part is to find out who married them and where. It could be at a justice of the peace's residence, it could be at a minister. So if you find the name of the clergyman who married your ancestor and you have the name of the town, that is where you want to look for church records to find your ancestors' baptism, see if they went to the same church. Google the name of the minister and the location. And sometimes, 7 out of 10 times, I will find a book or a history or some list of clergymen that will match up. And I now know it's the First Methodist Church in Bavaria, New York, and such things like that are quick to find.
All right, great. Thank you, David, for that kind of bonus tip there. So I do think we can kind of keep things moving along. Oh, actually, I spoke a little too soon. We just got a
Oh,
question in that I'll
great.
that we'll
Great.
handle in this question session, and then we'll still have that additional one at the end
Mhm.
for any remaining questions. But let's see here. So someone submitted, where can you find actual images of a vital record when on Ancestry.com, for example, when only the source is listed?
Okay. Now, the source might, in this case, be a transcription. Many times, Ancestry.com will work in an agreements with a state or a county to copy an index. So I'm not sure if you have a full transcription of the record with all the details, names, and dates, or if it's just an index. Finding the source that Ancestry has is a quick way of knowing where to go next. Typically, this is a question we get a lot with the Ask a Genealogist. So, and we have access to Ancestry. So, by all means, contact our Ask a Genealogist through the website. Say, this is the Ancestry page. This is the source that they gave me. What's my next step to get the original? Now, if it's a statewide vital record, you're obviously may try with the state. Sometimes records are transferred after a certain amount of time to the state archives. Like for instance, in Massachusetts, every record from 1841 when vital records started to 1930 are at the state archives. They're also in the city and town clerks. After 1930, 31 onward, they're with the city and town clerks, but they're also with the State Department of Vital Statistics. Oftentimes, there's set places that they release them in batches. Um, and if it's an early record, oftentimes it may be published somewhere and they just didn't have the legal right to copy the copyrighted book and they've abstracted it. But we'll be more than happy to help you. Tell them that David sent you.
All right, perfect. Thank you, David. A couple more questions coming in here.
Great.
So next up, someone would like to know, what is the availability of divorce records?
Again, it's going to vary in the location. I'm going to use Massachusetts as an example in this point. Massachusetts, starting in the colonial period, because even marital bliss didn't always exist in every household, even in the colonial days, were handled by the Supreme Judicial Court, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Early on, in fact, the governor and the governor's council had to actually hear your reason for wanting to put a divorce forward, and that could be from a man or a woman. And in the cases of later records, the Supreme Judicial Court handled divorces on a county level right on through the early part of the 1920s. And then in around 1922, divorce courts or family courts took on a level in the court, and the Supreme Judicial Court released them after that. If you go to Family Search and you go to Ancestry and look for divorce and the state or the county, you may find that some of them are copied. Your best bet is to contact the county where you believe the divorce occurred and see if they actually have divorce records in their collections. The earlier ones may have already been transcribed. The later ones, 19th and 20th century, may be in storage. It's not something typically you find a lot of online, but they do exist in many cases. And keep in mind with a divorce, it may have not been a divorce. It could have just been a legal separation. And if that's the case, separation support is a probate document you'll find as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, David.
Mhm.
And then we have a couple more questions here. They're kind of related, so I'm going to ask them together if that's all right with you. They're
Sure, of
submitted by the
course.
same person.
Yeah.
So this person is wondering if you had a relative in prison, but the prison is now closed, what
Mhm.
records might be available to find? And
Sure.
then so, or maybe I'll let you answer that. The other one is kind of about an ancestor who was in an insane asylum that is now closed,
Mhm.
and the relative passed away there. What records might be available for that? So, kind of
Sure.
related, but different.
Yeah. Well, let me break into the prison one first. No pun intended. Prison records are typically open after 100 years in most states. In fact, you can even find prisoners that are listed after they've been incarcerated on databases online now. So if you ever wonder what happened to Cousin Charlie, you may be able to find a state prisoner locator uh, online. Now, taken in the case of ancestors that were in prison and the prison's closed, if the prison is operated by the federal government, you want to contact the Regional National Archives branch. Like, say, if they were in Leavenworth, for instance, which is still open. If it was a state prison, the records of a closed prison should, in all plausible means, be at the state archives, as the case is the records for Charlestown Prison, which is the state prison in Massachusetts. If the record was on a county level, it would be possibly in the county historical society or with the county sheriff's department. If it's a town level jail or small prison, the records may be in the custody of the historical society or the police department. And that's true across the board. There are some prison records available on Family Search and Ancestry. Sometimes you can even find mugshots. On the other institution, for mental health, that's a sticky one because of freedom of information doesn't always apply to HIPAA, whereas protection of those for mental or physical ailments are even protected after they're dead. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for instance, if there was a closed state hospital, I actually had a great uncle that was injured in a train accident and was basically placed away at this Taunton State Hospital. Although Taunton State Hospital burned, but before they burned, their records had been only moved to another part of the building. And so a lot of them were destroyed. But if the records did survive, they would have ended up, because it's a state hospital, in the Mass State Archives. In Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you need to do the following to become essentially a custodian of the records. First off, it can't be your third cousin 4 times removed record that you're just curious to see. Typically has to be a direct relative, parent, grandparent, great grandparent, etc. You have to go before a court and you have to become a temporary executor to your ancestors' estate, which is usually $100 to a couple $100 going before a judge. And you want to tell them the reason you want it. It's not just for genealogical purposes. Maybe you're curious about the mental health history of your family, and that is a valid reason. Saying you're genealogically curious, it doesn't always open the doors. Now, that being said, that doesn't automatically get the record in Massachusetts open for you. You then contact the Massachusetts State Archives. They put you in touch with the Department of Public Health, and then they weigh in the decision if the record can be released to you. Give you an example, my own grandfather was in a tuberculosis sanitarium in 1940 for a year. I have not been able to petition to get the record. Other states, you might have better luck, but it's a case by case basis with mental health records. And it's again to protect the individual who was a patient and for their descendants, because I hate to say it, some people are looking for the wrong reasons.
All right. Thank you so much, David. So I'll hand things back over to you. As I mentioned, we will have one more question session before we wrap up tonight. So any final questions, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A panel and we'll get to those. But for now, we'll keep things moving along. And David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. Well, in the natural progression of genealogical sources, we'll now talk about census records. But what I'm going to toss out first is a tip. And of course, why do we use census? Is because the census is to anchor a person in a place and time. And the person's genealogical question that you might be looking at when you go over your plan is I need to find this record. And you know that it's between 1790 and 1950. Well, that decennial census is going to come into play because that's going to give you your location. One thing to note are the early censuses between 1790 and 1850. Many of them are you're only going to find the head of household, male or female, with one exception. The 1840 federal census actually has a special accounting at the end of each town. It gives you the name of the Revolutionary War pensioner, may it be the veteran or his widow, that is in that community. So you get a little extra information. So in this case, we have the 1840 census for this family, and we are now finding that Erastus Austin has somebody under 5 that's a male in his household, and then we find that he falls into the category of being 30 to 40. He has 2 females under 5 and 1 female 30 to 40. So that's probably his wife, himself, and his 3 children. But is it? The reason that this census is valuable is it gives us a picture of our ancestors, but it doesn't show us clearly the family relationships. Is that 5-year-old his son or his deceased brother's boy that he is now taking care of? Are the other 3, 2 of them his daughters and 1 a girl that happens to be living with them in the same household they're taking care of? And is that female 30 to 40 his wife, or did she die and that's actually his sister living with them? It opens up a lot more questions that are answered by later censuses. On Ancestry.com, you can download a lot of the census blanks. So when you're looking at the information, you can transcribe the columns, essentially the tick marks. And you want to look at the census for not just your ancestors' household. If it's done house by house, is the neighbor on either side or a couple of doors down a family member? Do you notice a pattern of other surnames in the census that have the same last name? It's probably a good chance it could be siblings or children. And is that older person living in a household somebody you don't know? Maybe that's the name of his daughter's married husband, and you recognize her name as Elizabeth. So these forms are really going to be a great clue for you to use to fill in the blanks. So what we want to get into more detail. So let's go ahead to the next census, was done in 1850. So in the next slide, we see that the census with names and places of origin of each person in the household. We now know more about Erastus. We can find out that he is born in Connecticut, but it was mistranscribed as Canada on Ancestry. Somebody didn't read the handwriting correctly. Deborah was born in Massachusetts, And there's an older style S where it kind of drops down where the first S looks like an F. And then the children, Francis, Ellen, and Emily, are there. And maybe Emily is your ancestor. And that kind of puts them all into context. Now, where's that boy? That 5-year-old boy in 1840 was born in 1835. Is he now 15 years old and now working on a farm or living elsewhere, or did he die? Comparing the decennial censuses will open up more questions in your research plan. Um, Tips about the census I want to toss out, and these are going to include more than just your common resources, but the limitations in the time frame. So one of the things about census taker, didn't have to talk to anyone in the house. That's right. The person next door could have answered the questions for you. Could they talk to a neighbor if no one was home? Surely they could. How about if the neighbor didn't really know how old your ancestor's wife was? She could be now younger than she should be, or maybe a little older than she should be, based on somebody else's speculation. Or did one of the children answer the door? What we view are copies of the originals itself, and the censuses themselves have now been microfilmed. So if it's a clear copy, you can usually get the best access to them. A lot of the original censuses were destroyed after filming in some places. Families were not asked to spell their name. So if you're having trouble, definitely turn on Soundex searching or sounds like, because that will give alternative spellings. Even my own last name, Lambert, when we first came over from Ireland and the early records up in Canada were recorded as Lampert, and we now use Lambert. It's not clear, but we're pretty sure the name was Lampert. They didn't know how to spell it, and they've changed it to Lambert because of the consistency. And one myth I do want to dispel, names were not changed at Ellis Island. Now, knowing the family in the United States Census is pretty quick forward. And again, this is going to be in your handouts and syllabus there. So 1790 to 1840 lists only the name of the head of household for review. 1850 to 1870 lists everyone in the household, but not how they're related. So going back to Erastus again, we can make some speculations. Maybe you know enough that Emily is your ancestor, so you know that's his daughter, but we don't find out until 1880. We can assume most people in the household are family members. 1880 to 1950 relationships are listed. Now, families that are grouped, people that are grouped together that may appear, and this kind of goes back to someone's question they had about prisons and mental health. If they were happen to be living in a institution, mental health or a prison at the decennial year, they'll find them with non-related people. Those are all the other inmates. So don't be surprised to find that. The Canadian census has various provinces that exist, and sometimes they're census substitutes, which mean they're like tax lists or military lists, etc. But typically you can find some for 1825, 1831, 1842 for parts of Ontario and Quebec, 1851, 1861, 71, 81, 91, 1901 are standard for most of Canada. Not every province is going to be the same rule. 1906, 1911, 1916, and 1921. And 21 is one of the censuses that you've probably looked for. If you're looking for the most common, that is the 21 for Canada. And online resources, you can find Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org have these available. And keep in mind that FamilySearch.org is free. Ancestry.com requires a subscription. In the United Kingdom, for England and Wales, there's been a decennial census since 1841. And currently, right now, they have released the 1921 just this week. So a little amendment to this slide that the 1921 census is now available. Scotland, 1841, 1851, 61, 71, 81, 91, 1901, and 11 as well. So 21. And these can be found on Ancestry.com, Family Search, and for the Scottish censuses, Scotland's people.gov.uk. For Ireland, we have survived censuses from 1901 and 1911, and a small amount survived the Four Courts fire in Dublin. Partial censuses for some places exist for 1821, 31, 41, and 51. These are actually the books of the census that were out in another part of the where the Four Courts records office was that was destroyed. So they weren't there at the time of the fire when the majority of the records were burned. And you can find those online on census.nationalarchives.ie. Now, obviously, our ancestors came from somewhere, and maybe they became a United States citizen after 1791. Now, a tip for naturalizations is to use immigration and naturalization records to answer, obviously, where your ancestor is from. The earliest immigration and naturalization records may not give you exactly down to the village in Ireland that your ancestor came from, or Germany, etc., but it might give you at least more of a clue. Sometimes even knowing the county in Ireland might be a good starting point. So when you know the where it's from, the records itself are going to open up the door to that for you. Now, before 1820, it was not required to file manifest when a vessel came in. And one of the things that I find here is a great way of finding passenger lists is on ancestry.com. They have digitized pretty much all of the passenger lists, right down to plane trips in the 1950s that exist there from the National Archives. All of the National Archives records were digitized by ancestry.com for passenger list. And the nice thing is that many of them are indexed, but not always 100%. I'll give you an example. A naturalization I was just doing the other day for a friend. She was looking for a man by the name of Michael Tedesco. Well, when I looked at his naturalization, sure enough, he arrived on June 6th, 1909 on a vessel at Carnovia, and I went through the list, and it wasn't apparent in the index to that passenger list that he was there. I even used MI and then looked for the last name under T and looked with just limited amounts of letters and changed it to sound X. Still didn't help. I went to the the naturalization record told me the line and the list number. Well, I found it. His name wasn't Michael, it was Michelangelo. And what it actually did for me was actually give me the fact that Tedesco was his last name. His mother's had remarried, but the children had another name, so it was indexed incorrectly. Now, what we're looking at here is an index to the Superior Court in New York City for James Crody. And we get a little bit of the details, finding that he was naturalized in March of 1863. We can find out that the volume for the naturalization is 126, record number 38. We found out that he's living in Fordham, Westchester County when he was naturalized. He was a laborer. And then we could find out that the witnesses to his naturalization, which are individuals that are already naturalized. Now, that could be a sibling, a coworker, or somebody he went to church with, somebody who actually knew him and would verify the fact. Later naturalizations give us more clues. Here we have Arma Makey residing in Blymer Avenue in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Domestic, she is 5'2", 150 pounds, that she was born in Kanganismian, Finland, December 15th, 1895, and her husband's name is Emil Makey, and that they were married in 1916 in Lanesville, Massachusetts, that he was born in Sarijani, Finland in 1895, and that when he arrived in 1914, it mentions their children with their dates of birth. Some great information. As you can see at the very bottom, there's also a photograph of her. Advanced sources to look for records include things like probates. These could be the last will and testaments, or maybe you died without a will, and the intestate record is almost as valuable, giving you a listing of a petition, citation, decree, and later records, which would name all the heirs of the state. It will also give an inventory, which to me is a time capsule. It's like peering back through the window of your ancestor's house and seeing what's in every cupboard, every chest, and what's in every box. that they had, right down to what animals are in the barn. Land records are also a valuable resource because it's going to tell us where our ancestors arrived from. Maybe they were purchasing land in another place before they settled there, as many of mine did. Other sources of information include military records, newspapers, published genealogies, town county histories, cemetery and burial records, tax records, city directories, and town records. Let's talk a little bit about starting with military records. So here we are. Luckily, that this family actually had a photograph of their ancestor and his best friend that were being inducted into World War I. Well, we found out that Warren Stinson Homer had filed a draft registration card, and it gives his date of birth. It says that he's a student at Dartmouth College and that he was employed in Hanover, Grafton, New Hampshire. It also says that his nearest relative was a guardian, A.V. Cannon, living in Cleveland, Ohio. And there's his signature on the back of the card. Even though it's black and white photograph, I can tell you that he had blue eyes and light color hair. Some of the draft registration cards, and these you can find on Family Search and Ancestry for World War I and also World War II, are great clues to determine if someone served in the military. But that being said, just because you filled out a draft registration card didn't mean you served. Swapping over to newspapers, sometimes newspapers will just open up the page to want to do more research. In this case, newspapers are being OCR'd, optical character recognized, where the text is being searchable. We have databases on American ancestors that are in our external database, including early American newspapers, which you can use, and those go back to the early papers back to 1704, the Boston Newsletter, and cover a lot of the East Coast in the colonial right through the early part of the 18 teens and 20s. In this article, Mr. Lucius Crowell, who resided in the north part of Angelica, was killed on the 21st of that month by the fall of a tree which he was chopping. He had a large family. Well, does he have a probate? Now we want to look at probate records because what happened to the kids? Were their guardians assigned? Is there a gravestone for him? Does he have any land that had to be sold to settle his debt? As you can see, this one newspaper article opens up another series of research plans with research questions. NEHS has a great collection of family genealogies at our Library of American Ancestors. And our collections, again, started back in 1845 as we gathered up published genealogies. Genealogies are an excellent finding aid for these pre-1800 families for these early compilations. And also, don't forget town histories that may have great chapters in them for the families of that community. In this case, the history of Mercer County on our next slide. Mercer County, Pennsylvania has a gazetteer, and that gives a variety of different things about individuals in the town. And it may be something from college yearbooks to alumni books to older county histories published before this one that may give you enough clues to then want to seek out in your research plan to find the original records. Again, these early histories and genealogies, often cases weren't cited. So now you have to be the editor and find the sources to confirm. Town records are great, and then this is the 1798 Hinsdale, New Hampshire tax records. And at the bottom left, it has the officers of the town, including the hogreaves, the fence viewers. And anyone know what a hogreave was? Well, that was someone who tracked down the loose pigs, assessing property damage and preventing the wandering of the pigs and animals in the community. Also, one would do is tagging of ears of livestock was often recorded in the town records, so the owner of animals could be identified. And cattle marks are often a good way of knowing when your ancestor arrived into the community or when someone died, because the mark may be transferred to a son of that individual. In St. Mary's Cemetery transcriptions, part of the Hale collection of cemeteries have transcriptions of gravestones, and this was done as part of a WPA project from 1932 to 35, and it has over 2,000 Connecticut cemeteries. Why are these valuable? You might say, well, I'll just go and look at the gravestone. These were done over 90 years ago in some cases, and that old marble gravestone may no longer be as legible as it was at one point in time, or the stone even could be broken. So refer to transcriptions. They're a great source of information when the stone is harder to read now. Compilations such as baptisms, marriages, and deaths for the Boston church records are available on AmericanAncestors.org. So you can find these old published accounts are available now to search. Looking at the birth record, you may not find a birth because the town clerk's office burnt down or the town hall burnt down. But if you find the church record, it may be simply around the same time. So in a lot of cases, church records will fill the blanks for an age of somebody when a birth record does not exist or the town didn't keep them that early. Bible records at American Ancestors, we have thousands of these. And very soon we'll be releasing many of these digitally on our DLA, our Digital Library Archive. As you may have seen years ago, we created a CD-ROM. We're taking it to the next level now. Bible records are rare but very helpful. They're maintained by a variety of places besides American Ancestors and other genealogical societies. In fact, there's a very large collection at the DAR Library in Washington, D.C. And maybe you have a copy of your own family Bible at home. In summary, a reference interview, you want to focus that is if you're going to be the genealogist of the day, you want to ask yourself the question that you then want to turn to American Ancestors and other genealogists and ask. Think of yourself in our shoes. Focus on the place and time as well as the name. You want to know the best source to find, so let's ask that question. What is the skill of the patron? Are you a beginner or are you an advanced researcher? So tell us that. That way we can point you to sources that you may have not looked at. Or if you've been doing this for years, maybe something above and beyond. That's why having a research plan is available. Now, as our patrons seeking to access special local history collections that we have, looking at the collections that exist for your ancestors' location is how we can best help you. Again, turn to Ask a Genealogist so we can get those questions answered when you're having a little trouble yourself. With genealogists, you're going to start with what known and work backwards. That's the best approach for you to do. Research process involves identifying what you know, writing it down, deciding on a specific research goal, and identifying sources, doing the research and analyzing what you find. And remember, the census and vital records are the backbone of genealogical sources, but they're not the limit. Thank you very much, and I'm glad at this point to take on further questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, David, for that great lecture tonight. So much great information shared there that we'll continue to build on as well. So now we'll move into our final Q&A session. So first up here, David, we did get a question from somebody wondering if you could reiterate where to find naturalization records. This
Mhm.
person has been looking for an ancestor who immigrated from Ireland in the kind of late 1800s, and and hasn't been able to find them on a passenger list, and is wondering if the naturalization record might help them find that.
You may find at least the county in Ireland, if not the fact that they did come over in Ireland on the date, and then maybe find the vessel year, because they sometimes, depending when they arrived, the more detail you'll find in a naturalization. So naturalizations prior to 1906 could have been done in any court. So there could be in a police court, a district court, and whatnot. For the most part, naturalizations have been all digitized for the most part, and they're going to be found in places like ancestry.com, familysearch.org, or on Fold 3. Now, Fold 3 is owned by Ancestry, but that's their federal government uh, branch, if you will, for lack of a better word. That's where they're gathering up a lot of military records, but some naturalizations. Um, the originals of these records, if it's a federal record, is going to be at the regional branch of the National Archives near where that person was living. So Massachusetts original naturalizations, those are at our regional New England branch in Waltham, Mass. But I can find most of the same records online on, say, Ancestry, and in even some cases on Family Search.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Let's see, another question here. Someone says, my great grandfather's parents came from somewhere in Ireland. I believe he passed through Gross in St. Lawrence. Do you have any access to those records or recommendations for where to look?
Okay, Point Grosse in the St. Lawrence up in Quebec. I'm just if they could confirm that. I'm thinking they mean Canadian immigration.
Yes, Kathy, if you'd like to write in to confirm that, we can come back to your question. So we'll give you a moment to do
Uh,
that. Um, while we wait for that answer, David, we do have another question here from someone wondering if a newspaper that you're looking for isn't on newspapers.com, where is
mhm.
the best place to look for those records?
Sure. Well, I always say to contact the community itself. So before there were digital newspapers, they were on microfilm. In fact, most of the digital newspapers that exist were not done from sheets of paper, someone digitizing scan by scan. They did them from rolls of microfilm. If it's an early newspaper, many of them are from microfilm that are at the Worcester Antiquarian Society for if it's a regional branch in, say, New England, the earliest papers. However, contacting the public library where the town was from, they may have it on rolls of microfilm and have a small price to charge to search through it. So if you gave them some dates from deaths, say you want to find obituaries or marriage notice, and the microfilm hasn't been digitized, that might be the best approach. Also, state libraries are great for having newspapers on microfilm because not every newspaper that exists has been microfilmed and not every microfilm has been digitized. My own hometown, we just recently got all of our newspapers digitized from the microfilm, and I've been using it left and right. It's a great way of doing it. So stay tuned, but don't wait. Just contact the local public library to start with. Or ask a genealogist to give you a hand as well once you know the location specifically.
All right, perfect. Thank you, David.
Mhm.
And Kathy did get back to us. So I'll just repeat her question. She did confirm it's in Canada.
Mhm.
So she said, my great grandfather's parents came from somewhere in Ireland. I believe he passed through Gross in St. Lawrence. And she's looking for kind of records for that. And she also added that they settled in Denison Mills, Quebec.
Okay. The problem is there's not going to be a naturalization. You're a British subject settling in Canada, which is a British colony. So passenger lists in Canada are very limited prior to the 1860s because Canada doesn't become it under the Confederation of 1867. You start to see more passenger lists. They're very spotty before that. And I'm in the same boat. My family comes to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in the early 1800s, prior to 1830, and there aren't passenger lists. And of course, they're in Canada. If their ancestor comes to America, then it's easy because then it's sort of like two boat immigration, where they're going to from Ireland to Canada, Canada to America. So it may be a little bit more difficult. Um, what you may find is when they joined the church, you might find a year that they arrived, and then from there inquire um, with the Canadian Archives in Ottawa to see if there are any passenger arrivals that occur before that date. So you want to know the earliest occurrence you can find their parents in Canada and start looking at lists before that do survive. Good luck with that. It's a tough problem, but it's possibly something you can solve.
Great, thank you. And then another question here, someone says, if birth records do not exist, can baptismal records, if available, substitute typically for proving lineage, or does that vary?
If you're using it for a lineage society, or if you're doing it for your proving the generations, a baptism will often list both parents on it. So that is just as good for anything like the SAR, the DAR, the Mayflower Society, because in a lot of cases, civil registration didn't start. Massachusetts was the earliest state in the Union to require Birth, marriage, and death to be recorded, and that goes only back to 1841. So, depending on the town clerk or the city clerk that your ancestors lived in, did they keep good records? Give you an example. Boston, Massachusetts has fairly good records from 1630 to about 1790 for births. And then they don't record hardly any of them for the next 50 years. In fact, 10 years after the state of Massachusetts is requiring birth, marriages, and deaths, uh, Boston has neglected to record most of the marriages and the births. So it's going to vary from place to place.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, David. It's looking like that does wrap up questions for tonight, so I think we will leave things there.
Okay.
But if you, for those of you listening out there, if you do think of a question later on, do feel free to write to us at at education at nehgs.org. Or you can also email David directly and he'd be happy to answer your questions. You'll find his email at the course page and also on the handout that he created for tonight as well. And if you are interested in having us do research on your behalf, you can contact us at research@nehgs.org. And if you have more general reference questions about area of your family history, David mentioned that Ask a Genealogist chat. I'd also like to recommend that. It's a great resource. It's totally free. It's available Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time. And you can access that at americanancestors.org/chat. Again, totally free and open to the public. We highly recommend checking that out. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with one of our experts at the link shown on the screen here or through the QR code displayed there as well. I'll also mention David is one of our genealogists who gives a lot of these consultations. So you can book one with him if you'd like to do that. You'll find a recording of tonight's class as well as the handout and the slides at the course webpage shown here on the screen. The URL has been shared with you by email, and you can also find it under the My Account section of our website under digital content. And you will have access to all of these course materials for the foreseeable future. So thank you again for joining us for the second class of our 5-session seminar. Be sure to join us again next week when Rhonda will kind of take us further into this topic, talking about identifying and locating your sources. Actually, sorry, I said Rhonda. David, that's you.
I was
You'll
going
be
to
coming
say I'm
back.
off the hook for next week, apparently. It's
Sorry about
okay.
that.
You'll be meeting me, and you'll get Rhonda at the end, and Melanie right before
Exactly.
Rhonda, and after me next week. That's okay.
Exactly. I'll give you your credit. So yes, David will be coming back to talk with you about that. So you can join us for that class session just by going to the same course page and clicking on the same link that you used to join tonight's class. And if you would like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, you can visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org. So big thank you again to David, and we will be seeing him next week, I promise. And I look forward to seeing you all online again next week, and goodbye for now.